It looks like 5s and 4s. So we'll start with Bob Neef, K-N-I-E-F-F. I hope it's Bob Neef. When, in your estimation, will humans land on Mars? Also, just for fun, when will a human land on Pluto? If you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, Bob, I would have said, I don't think they're going to land on Mars. I really didn't. And had been so disappointed by NASA and so simply blown away by all of the, the destruction of NASA as a team that accomplishes a mission and its conversion into a standing army of bureaucrats. And then along comes Elon Musk, who had made some big promises. I'll tell you when I began to think we might actually go to Mars. I began to think we might go to Mars when Falcon Heavy put the Tesla Roadster in orbit, and I saw the two boosters come back and make simultaneous landings at the Kennedy Space Center. That's when I began to realize, we might actually do it. And my confidence in this was and is bolstered by the fact that everything useful that's ever been done, not useful, everything amazing that's ever been done, and I can't think of an exception to this. Here's Mr. Scotty Odd. Hang on a second, please, while I put on my reading spectacles and find out what's going on here. Just a second here. I know you're in the mood. No, I'd like to get it done now. Sorry. Let's see what he says. But when I saw those boosters coming back, I thought everything exceptional that's ever happened has largely been the result of either one person's vision. It's never one person. There's always a team that has to execute, and that team has to believe in the product. But it's always a vision that's driven by one individual. I can't think of many exceptions to this case. I was talking with my beautiful... Perfect. He should be home in 40 minutes. I love it. Excuse me again. Sorry. I was talking with Natasha about this. We were talking about the iPhone, and just give you an idea why I think that we might go to Mars, because Elon Musk is Elon Musk, and he's very eccentric and very unusual and so on. But this device has changed the world. I mean, the smartphone has changed the world. We didn't know we needed it until we got it. And then once we had it, we can't imagine how we lived without it. Uber is just one example of one of hundreds of examples of a technology that is so unbelievably useful and cool. And none of it would have been possible without the smartphone. And the smartphone wouldn't have been possible without Steve Jobs. I know he's a very unpleasant individual in a lot of ways. None of that matters really to me. I'm sure it matters to his kids and his family, but to me, it's the price of genius. And the story, in a nutshell, the reason we have Uber and I've got flight navigation programs that I can put on my iPhone that'll guide me anywhere in the world to within 3 feet, and that's probably all I need. If I can find myself within 3 feet of an airport, chances are pretty good I'm going to be able to make the landing. George, that's my favorite name, I think. George said Tim Cook is worse. Tim Cook is the anti-Jobs. Tim Cook is the current president of Apple. He's an administrator, he's a manager, and he is kind of a bureaucrat. And that's why Apple hasn't done anything interesting since Steve Jobs died. But let's just take this device just for 1 second. I'm mashing the story, but it's not too far off the mark to say that Steve Jobs went to the Apple engineers. They just finished the iPod and so on, which itself seemed pretty amazing at the time. And he said, okay, what I want to do next is I want to do a phone. Okay, well, we've got cell phones, flip phones that are about that size. Yes, but I want it also to have a camera. I guess an interesting challenge, Steve. I think we could find a way to work that out. And I also want it to be an iPod. So I want the iPod in it. Okay. So it can play all your music, yeah. And it has to have GPS. What now? Yeah, the phone has to know where it is. Really? Yeah, and not only does the phone have to know where it is, the phone has to know its own orientation. It needs to have accelerometers in there and solid state gyroscopes so that the phone knows what its angle is and so that you can steer things with the phone and so on. And a number of engineers just said, Steve, that's impossible, can't be done. And he basically said, if you think it's impossible, you're fired. Your job is not to tell me whether it's possible or not. Your job is to tell me how to do it. Your job is to figure out a way to do it. This is what it has to have in it, and now you're going to find a way to make it happen. And without that, this wouldn't be here. There's no way, there's zero chance that a committee could have possibly designed and built one of these. Just not possible. Government couldn't have done it, and IBM couldn't have done it because they'd have to get all this stuff past the board and all the rest of it. And he just said, no, well, I don't care. I know it's difficult, but it's not impossible. Do it. And so they did it. And then just because of the kind of person he was, he got his one of the prototypes, before early prototype. And instead of putting it up on top of a velvet cushion and admiring it, he just stuck it in his pocket for a week. And after a week, he comes and shows his engineers, and the screen is just completely scratched. And virtually unreadable. And he said, we can't have this. And they said, well, Steve, you put it in your pocket and you got keys in there and coins in there. And Steve Jobs says, I know that. Other people have keys and coins too. They're going to put it in their pocket. They're not going to put this thing in a special case. You need to make glass that's hard enough to resist the scratches. Well, this is the hardest glass that we have, Steve. There's no harder glass than this. Well, then do some chemistry and find me a glass that will not be scratched by keys. I've had this iPhone in my pocket. I've had a number of them I've had them since 2010, maybe 11, something like that. I know some people have, but I personally have never put a scratch on an iPhone, ever. And I remember any number of the old cell phones being just useless after a while. Build it, do it. So to answer your question, Bob, if I'll conditionally say that Elon Musk has said he will send people in an Apollo 8 type flyby mission around the moon. I think he said he'd do it in 2 years, which means by about 2021. If that flight occurs if the flight around the moon occurs before 2022, then I'd say we could be on Mars by 2030. If that flight is delayed, I would say it's going to be 8 to 10 years after that flight is successful. And I don't think it will be delayed. And by the way, everybody knows about SpaceX, but Blue Origin is interesting because Blue Origin's been very secretive. Blue Origin is owned by Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos owns everything. And he owns the entire planet, and he will own even more of it by the time we're finished with the show in 45 minutes. Bezos has the kind of money that governments are reluctant to spend. And one of the things, that's hard for people like us to really understand, I mean, we can imagine it, but we can't really connect to it. There comes a point when you have made, when you've made so much money that you literally cannot spend it. You cannot spend it. You can't, you're making so much money so fast you cannot spend it. And certainly you cannot spend it on anything that would improve your lifestyle to any degree. In other words, you could have every single car you ever wanted. You could have 50 houses, all this other stuff. When you get into that kind of money, it doesn't matter how much more he makes because his life cannot be improved. I don't know what that number is, but I'm going to guess it's somewhere around, $50 million, $100 million, somewhere around there. You really cannot improve the quality of your life when you get that kind of money and above. So he's going to do something world-changing with it, and he's got the money to do it. So every time I order something from Amazon, I'm expecting something today. I know I'm putting retailers out of business, and I feel bad about that, but Stagecoach, the guys who made Stagecoach wagon wheels and hoop skirts from whale baleen, they're not around anymore either. And that's just the way things are. So if I'm going to pay shipping and handling to somebody to bring me something to my door, it actually makes me feel considerably better about all of this. Not that I felt bad in the first place, but makes me feel even better than knowing that it's going to use to put humans in space. Eric Blake says Bezos is Edison, Musk is Tesla. That's not a bad description. And yet another reason why I suspect it might actually be Bezos instead of Musk. I mean, we have, Southern California Edison and not Southern California Tesla, because while Edison was an inventor and wasn't, people like to say Edison didn't do anything, Tesla did everything. That's nonsense. Edison was a brilliant man, a brilliant inventor. He was a great businessman, and he took terrible advantage of Tesla. But my point is, Edison knew how to make this into a business and run it as an empire and make enormous profits at it, and that's what it's going to take. So I would say if the flight around the moon goes within the next 2-3 years, I'd say 2030 for Mars. Now, Pluto is nuts because, and when I say nuts, Bob, I mean it's just no way to predict it, because genuinely, literally, there's no reason to go there. There is so much more to see before you go there. I'm sure we'll send, I was going to say I'm sure we'll send probes, but I got to tell you, the pictures that the flyby happened just earlier, about a year now, a little less, something like that. And they're still sending back pictures. The thing recorded so much data, and the signal is so weak that we're getting pictures never before seen by anybody of Pluto on a daily basis that are coming down. So, if we're on Pluto by 2100, that means we're everywhere. If we're on Pluto, even if it's just a put the foot down mission to Pluto, if we're on Pluto, we're everywhere, because there's no damn reason to go out there that far unless it's just for a lark, because you can. The limitation on all of this, by far, is rockets. By far. The problem is a simple one in terms of understanding it, but it's an exceedingly complex one when you're designing things and so on. But, if you look at the Saturn V rockets, 365 feet tall, right? You see this giant, enormous, fantastic white structure. All of this is to bring that tiny little triangle of the command module back from the moon. And everything else is spent to bring that back. And when that thing comes back, it's used up anyway. But it's a good example of the problem that you face, because if we put an extra 10 pounds on the capsule, then we have to put the fuel to get that extra 10 pounds to the moon, and then we got to get the fuel to put it back from the moon, and then we have to add fuel to cover the weight of the fuel that we've added, and then that fuel has to be accounted for, and on and on and on and on and on we go. We really, the measure of a rocket's efficiency is called specific impulse, and specific impulse basically tells you how much push you get for a unit of fuel. It's a measure of efficiency, not thrust. Ion engines have very high specific impulse. They're very, very efficient, but the thrust is so low that it takes them, 10 years to get up to speed, 6 years, that kind of thing. Chemical rockets, on the other hand, lots and lots of thrust, enough to get you off of the surface of the Earth, out of this big, natural, nasty gravity well that we live in. But they're just not very efficient. You can't carry enough fuel to burn them fast enough. We sent New Horizons to Pluto, and it got there in less than 10, 8 or 9 years to go to Pluto? Most missions to Jupiter took that long. This little probe got to the moon took Apollo 3 days to get to the moon. And I want to say New Horizons did it in something like 6 hours, 7 hours. It took 6-7 years to get the Voyagers and Galileo to Jupiter, and I think New Horizons did it in a couple, 12 months, 13, 14 months, something like that. That thing was hauling ass. And it was hauling ass because it was a suicide mission. It didn't have to carry the fuel necessary to slow down at the other end. You just burned pretty much every drop you had. You keep a little for course corrections, and you just, thing goes through the solar system like a bullet, and you time it just right, goes right past Pluto, turns around, takes pictures of everything, and then sails off into the solar system. I don't know when it's going to pass the Voyagers, which were launched in the mid-'70s, but it won't be too long before it's past them because it's going so much faster. So there's a lot of energy sources out there, but the problem is not that there is not so much energy. The problem is turning energy into thrust. That's the issue. So a measure of a specific impulse is it's measured in seconds. It's a measure of the thrust over time kind of thing. But the equations come out so that the answers are in seconds. And give you an idea, it's off the top of my head from memory, but the Saturn V main engines, I want to say, had an ISP, specific impulse, of about 250. The shuttle engines were significantly more efficient. I think they were 450. Nuclear rockets that we built in the 60s and 70s out in Jackass Flats, Nevada at the nuclear nerds and nuclear research. Anyway, the program was called NERVA. And we built something like 20 or 25 functioning nuclear rockets. And because these are not using the energy of chemical reactions where you're taking, alcohol or hydrazine or something like that and mixing it with an oxidizer, in a nuclear rocket, you're just getting a whole bunch of uranium together, let it get really, really, really hot, pour some hydrogen over it, and have that hydrogen expand. And it's the energy of the expanse that matters, because the more energetic that expanse, the more thrust you get. The more thrust you get, the faster you can go on a unit of fuel. The NERVA rockets were coming in, the early ones were coming in at 700, 800. Certainly with a little tweaking, you could get to 850, 900. You get double the efficiency of a space shuttle main engine. They could run on hydrogen. So if you can find water in space, out on Ceres or on Mars or something like that, you scoop up some of the water, you chemically split it into its two parts, you take the hydrogen and you run it for fuel, and you take the oxygen and you use it to breathe, and everybody's happy. So if we're really talking about exploring the solar system, nuclear rockets are the only thing that's even conceivably on the board. So like I said, the thing that matters is how energetic is that expansion of the gas. That energy is determined by how hot the combustion chamber is. The hotter it is, the more energy you can get out of it. The more your fuel, whether it's hydrogen or whatever, the more it'll expand, and more aggressively it expands, the more thrust there is. So a solid core nuclear rocket, like the ones at NERVA, which is basically just a giant cylinder full of uranium at critical temperatures, and you just literally squirt the liquid hydrogen through it, and it heats it up and come out the other end. That reaction is limited to about probably under 1,000 ISP, because if you made it hotter, then the engine would melt. You're now at temperatures that are really the upper limit for metals and ceramics. So what can you do about that? Well, they had an idea I don't think it's ever been built, but one of the things that had been considered was something called a gas core nuclear rocket. And now you're talking about making a magnetic field. Not so strong as for fusion. You need an incredibly strong magnetic field for fusion, but you could take a magnetic field and you could inject ionized, or rather uranium in a plasma state. And so basically the uranium is now gas, radioactive gas, and it's held in this bottle, but it's not compressed to fusion, it's just held there. But because the container is magnetic and not steel or ceramic, you can get to much higher temperatures. Now you're starting to get to ISPs of around 2,000, 2,500, that kind of thing. Now you're starting to get fairly close to being serious. But frankly, I hope, I didn't believe this much before, but I'm beginning to have a little more hope. It's going to take something as revolutionary as the jet engine, more revolutionary than the jet engine. I think the only real answer to this is going to be some kind of reactionless drive. In other words, something that's not spewing stuff out of the back end. And we just don't know what that would look like just yet. There's some interesting stuff on the theory side. And this whole business of warping space-time actually seems like it could work. You could create if you could create an area of space in front of you that was less dense than the area behind you, you'd basically slide downhill in a straight line wherever you wanted to go. This is something that's always interested me too, since you asked the question, Bob. You know, Einstein's relativity theory says you cannot exceed the speed of light, and every single particle of evidence seems to say that's true. As you get faster and faster and faster, time slows down on board the vessel, but the vessel's apparent mass increases to the point where at the speed of light, the ship weighs as much as the universe. You can't push it past the speed limit of the speed of light. Cannot be done. And that has been the damning thing for science fiction guys like me and so on, to say that even if you could get to a really high relativistic speed, 0.8 c, 80%, 90% of the speed of light, it's not a terrible deal. You get to the nearest star in 5 years in a straight line. 5 years in a straight line, but you've got to accelerate to the speed of light, which at 1g is about a year. About 1g acceleration for about a year gets you pretty close to the speed of light. And then halfway around, you got to turn down and slow down the rest of the way. So it's probably 10 years to the nearest star under ideal, like theoretically best case scenario. But one thing that's interested me about this, and some people are working on it, I don't think I've ever heard anybody speak about it quite this way, is that we know we cannot exceed the speed of light, but what we don't talk about is that the speed of light is actually variable. That's interesting to me. The speed of light in water is considerably slower than the speed of light in air. That's why when you look at the water and you see a fish, the fish is shifted because the light coming out of the water is accelerating. When it hits the air, it's going into a less dense media, the light accelerates. Hard to believe, but that's what happens. So the speed of light in a vacuum is 186,262 miles a second in a vacuum. And you would think that there can be nothing less dense than a vacuum. But you might be wrong about that, because space itself, space-time, has structure. There's actual kind of a structure. It's not atoms and it's not matter, but there is a structure to space-time. And if you could find a way to weaken that structure, weaken the fabric of the actual universe, then your light beam should be able to accelerate into that medium out of a vacuum the same way that it accelerates out of water into the air. So you could be traveling at speeds higher than the speed of light as seen on Earth, although within this particular bubble, you are not exceeding the speed of light. But how you propagate a wave faster than the speed of light is beyond my primitive frozen caveman brain. So nevertheless, a reactionless ship, I think. Well, it took half an hour. We got one from